Hello everyone, welcome you all to another episode on Azure On Air. Today with me I have got Lars Klint and we are going to talk about multi-cloud, the most happening topic of now. Lars Klint is a Senior Developer Evangelist at Pluralsight and he is a prominent contributor in Microsoft Azure space and hence he has been recognized as an MVP by Microsoft. And he is also a very popular YouTube creator. Happy to have you on our show, Lars.
There's a lot of existing companies, a lot of very large companies, a lot of very established companies
Mhm.
that don't necessarily need all of the cloud computing right now. There's really two, in my world, there's kind of two versions of multi-cloud. One
Mm-hmm.
is, well, you use more than one cloud provider. You would have to, in many cases, or most cases, I'd say, have to build your own systems that monitors and manages multi-cloud. Like if you talk to middle management in any IT company or big company, they'll always love to say lift and shift because it sounds easy and it never is, right? It's still really difficult. It's still very complex. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's good to be here. Talk Azure. That's kind of what I do, so that's all good.
That's awesome, Lars. We are so excited to learn a lot about multi cloud scenarios from you. So let us get started with the very basic question of like how do you get engaged into the multi cloud space? What invites you to be the part of multi cloud scenarios?
Sure. So I've been, I'll backtrack a little bit. I've
Mm-hmm.
been doing cloud computing for maybe 10 years, 12 years, ever
Mm-hmm.
since sort of Azure was first out, not from the very, very beginning, but almost.
Mm-hmm.
And since, the whole journey through, cloud computing has sort of been one of the tools that we use. I'm a software developer, so whenever I was writing code, it was one of those things you could use maybe for some of it, for the whole project, for parts
Mm-hmm.
of it, whatever it might be. And that's still true, but it has become more and more sort of dominant, I think, for at least new projects, new startups, new companies, that there is a lot of focus on cloud computing, which makes sense because there's a lot of advantages to it. However, there is a lot of existing companies, a lot of very large companies, a lot of very established companies
Mm-hmm.
that don't necessarily need all of the cloud computing right now
Mm-hmm.
because they already have an established infrastructure. They have projects they're using. They have applications that are working just fine. And like the old saying is, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So they don't need all of that. And that's sort of because I like to look at computing and technology in general with sort of a practical approach. Like it's all
Mm-hmm.
good that we know, hey, this is the new JavaScript framework, this is how we use it. But if you can't apply it to something that's practical, I'm not really that interested. So having said all that, that's sort of where multi-cloud came in for
Mm-hmm.
me. It's one of those ways that, especially with Azure, where
Mm-hmm.
because Microsoft has such a large customer base from before cloud computing was a thing,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of Microsoft customers that go, I don't need all of Azure, but that little bit there I'd love. And that's where that
Mm-hmm.
whole idea of multi-cloud or even, hybrid came into being. Um, and there's so many advantages and disadvantages as well
Mm-hmm.
about using cloud computing, and multi-cloud. So that was the very long answer to how I got into multi-cloud or
Mm-hmm.
hybrid
Mm-hmm.
computing.
Awesome. Yes, I completely agree. As you said, I can correlate this to a number of customer scenarios that I have been exposed to, like wherein they cannot. Like at a stretch move everything to the cloud, or they might want certain services from Azure, certain from some other service provider. Yes, it completely makes sense, like how enterprises are adapting to cloud in their journey. Multi-cloud becomes inevitable. Yes.
Totally.
So, from your expertise, enlighten us saying that how to do it and what are all the options available in my journeys to in my journey to migrate to the cloud.
Sure, sure.
Mm.
So if we look at it sort of multi-cloud, I mean that's kind of what we're talking about, but it's cloud in general.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's really two in my world. There's kind of two versions of multi-cloud.
Mm-hmm.
One is, well, you use more than one cloud provider. Like most often, it's two. Like very rarely do you use more than two, and
Mm-hmm.
it's often AWS and something else. Now it's
Mm-hmm.
moving more and more towards being Azure and something else as well.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be real and say, well, AWS is the biggest cloud provider, the biggest
Mm-hmm.
platform with most users. So it's often is AWS is one of those options,
Mm-hmm.
but it's rarely more than two.
Mm-hmm.
and even two is very tricky
Mm-hmm.
to be untold, depending on how you sort of plan on using multi-cloud, because
Mm-hmm.
you could have um, what's called a siloed approach. So it's sort of like when you start a new project within your company. All right,
Mm-hmm.
you choose Azure or you choose AWS, or you choose Azure or you choose GCP, or whatever it is that your two options are. And
Mm-hmm.
and then you're in within that silo. You don't ever go into the other cloud. So the company itself is multi-cloud,
Mm-hmm.
but the products usually are not. So that's one way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Another way of doing it is that you have this sort of application by application, or feature selection for the cloud. So it could be, for example, if you
Mm-hmm.
have a large database that has images in it, well, maybe all the image functionality is hosted in one cloud because it's better at that, and all the business logic is another cloud. And then you get this sort of multi-cloud approach to the same product or even the same features sometimes. That can have a lot of benefits, but it's also often a lot more complex and more difficult. So that's one side, is sort of proper multi-cloud. Now the second choice for multi-cloud in my world is hybrid,
Yeah.
because if you do a hybrid setup, that means that you have something on premises. So
Mm-hmm.
that's often your existing data center, and you have something that's in the cloud. And for all intents and purposes, those are two clouds, right? It's multi-cloud, even though one is sort of on your data center. But cloud computing, it's just a data center, right? So those are the two ways that you can do
Mm-hmm.
multi-cloud. And then what was the other part of your question? Was how do you get started with it? Is that what you were asking?
Correct, correct. Yes. How should my journey look like? What are all the considerations should I have when I choose the cloud service provider or
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, it's what you have to. First of all, you have to assess: do I need multi-cloud? Like,
Mm.
because obviously it's much simpler if you're
Mm-hmm.
on a single cloud,
Mm.
and if it's AWS or Azure or even GCP, those clouds have most of the services that you would need. I would argue, like they're so
Mm-hmm.
developed and they're so mature that
Mm-hmm.
it's you don't need to have necessarily
Mm-hmm.
a multi-cloud setup. Now there could be certain benefits, and I'll just look at my cheat sheet here for why you would go multi-cloud, because I
Mm.
can't remember all the
Mm.
different things. But
Mm.
for example, pricing, right? So you could
Mm.
choose the service that has the best price.
Mm.
So if storage was really cheap on one cloud and less, not so much on the other, well, maybe you move a lot of your storage application storage
Mm.
onto that cloud.
Mm. Mm.
It could have something to do with scalability, so that when you have to scale something really fast, well, maybe one cloud is better for a certain product than another.
Mm-hmm.
It could be resilience, because well,
Mm.
if you had the same service on multiple clouds, well, if one breaks for whatever reason, whether there's an issue on
Absolutely.
the cloud or your
Mm.
application dies or whatever,
Mm.
you can then roll over to the other cloud.
Mm.
Now
Mm.
you would have to you would have to have an application that's really important, right, to do that, but it is a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Performance could be another thing. Some cloud features just are better performing than others. Um, it could be a risk management thing, so that it's just a business strategy, a business policy that we need to have a backup or failover in all
Mm-hmm.
cases.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a bank, or if you're I don't know, government, something. If you have
Where
stuff
I
that's really
cannot accommodate any
yeah.
downtimes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So there's many reasons why you might go multi-cloud, but you definitely need to consider those reasons, right? You don't want to just jump into it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now I understand that what could be the signs when I will have to consider multi-cloud. That is, especially the resilience part. Yes, I can, I can understand, correlate to the
Hmm.
scenarios where it would be critical. We say in case of banking applications, absolutely no downtime where I cannot rely on a single service provider. Also,
Yep.
I would like to know, are there any complexities in dealing with multiple service providers? How interoperable are they when I have a part of my application in Azure and part of the other component running in other service provider? How interoperable are they?
Um, I think the short answer is not a lot, like it's or
Okay.
not very,
Mhm.
because there's no. If you're AWS, why would you want to
Mhm.
basically encourage someone to use a competitor, right? Now, having said that, Azure does have quite a
Mhm.
few services that do work on multiple clouds, multiple environments.
Mhm.
The most prominent one in the last couple of years is Azure Arc.
Mhm.
So Azure Arc, as in ARC, like an arc, is a service that you can install on another data center. So that could be
Mhm.
your on-premises data center. It could
Mhm.
be AWS. It could be GCP, and you can manage, say, virtual machines,
Yeah.
um, SQL Server, Kubernetes, and so one more thing I can't remember now exactly.
Mhm.
But you can manage certain services or fundamental services really from
Mhm.
Azure, even though they're somewhere else.
Mhm.
The Sentinel SIEM, which is
Mhm.
secure, or what is SIEM short for? I can never remember that. Security and Incident something management.
Mhm.
Look it up.
Okay.
That also works across cloud. So
Mhm.
your security response and your security management, all that, you can get all that data from AWS
Mhm.
into Azure. There's tools that makes it really easy to move things from AWS to Azure. Now that's not really multi-cloud. That's sort of migration part of it.
Mhm.
But I don't think there's not a lot of tools that goes from AWS, for example, because well, why would they? So um, you would have to, in many cases, or most cases, I'd say, have to build your own systems that monitors and manages multi-cloud. And that might be all right. It might not be a big deal. It might be a really big deal. If it's something
Exactly.
like database management, that's not that difficult. There's lots of tools that allows you to have different endpoints. If it's
Mm.
a custom thing that has to look at, your ticketing system or your ordering system, it might be a lot of work to have that sort of admin stuff set up. So it depends a little bit, but I would say it's not that easy to get into. It's
Yes.
usually people that don't have to do the work that decides it.
Okay, so I understand that the operational complexities pitch in when I have my application spread across multiple service providers. Having said this, are there any compelling reasons why enterprises choose to go multi-cloud? Out of your experiences, have you seen any situations which demands for a multi-cloud setup, considering all these operational challenges?
Definitely. A lot of the companies that have gone into multi-cloud early on are the ones that had so many internal divisions
Mm-hmm.
that they just didn't have a common sort of platform as such. They didn't have to,
Mm. Mm,
right?
mm,
They
mm,
were so independent in all the different parts of the company that they sort of all went multi-cloud, and then suddenly they had to all talk to each other. And
mm.
usually how that was done was through microservices. So
Microsoft.
you would, expose an
Mm,
endpoint where you can get some data out. I know
mm,
Amazon internally is built like that, I believe. So
mm,
all the different parts of Amazon all talk to each other through microservices and endpoints.
mm, mm,
But something like compliance,
mm,
if you need to be compliant with a particular standard for auditing or a government regulation, or
mm,
in the US, it's very, very prominent to have like security stuff within like a government standard. I can't remember what they're called now, but there's a whole bunch of different government standards. So much so that both AWS and Azure have
mm.
specific government cloud.
Yes.
Um, so that could be a very compelling reason. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of countries have data that they won't allow to go out of the country. Like here in
Yes.
Australia, there's certain personal information and things that you
Mm-hmm.
can't share outside of the country's borders.
Mm,
So that could be another reason, is that you need a data center that's in a particular region.
mm-hmm.
That's becoming less and less um, important, I guess, because there are so many regions now, both from AWS and
Yeah.
Azure.
Mm-hmm.
But there are definitely ideas, and then there's just some companies just don't like to be locked in. They go like, if we put all our eggs in this one cloud basket over here and talk only AWS or Azure, well, no,
Mm,
we don't like that. We want to be able to jump ship or spread
mm-hmm.
our risk, as it
Mm-hmm.
were. So yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, I can completely correlate. Yes, so when my correct me if I am wrong with the understanding. What I understood from your explanation is enterprise has different business units which need to talk to each other for executing their business operations, but they have different skill set of people and completely independent modules in which each of them can choose to go with an independent service provider, and
yep.
making these as microservices, they can still achieve the communication to execute the business. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And that's always going to be an individual choice. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I can't speak for even one company I don't work for, right? It has to be a choice that you go through what your business model is and what you need to do, and you need to evaluate all the different risks and the benefits and all those things before you make a decision. And even then, you're probably not
Hmm.
sure you made the right decision. Like it's such a complex
Mhm.
environment to operate in that if you have to go with one cloud or multi-cloud, or some companies even like choose the cloud you want,
Mm,
um, kind of approach to within divisions. And
mm,
often there will be some direction, and there will be
mm-hmm.
something that companies sort of go, you maybe not choose, Oracle Cloud for whatever reason, or IBM Cloud, or whatever it
Yeah.
might be, right?
Mm,
That's definitely something that happens.
yeah.
But it's often, and especially if you start a new project, if you're in a small team that go, hey, you got to build this prototype, or you got to try this
Mm,
out.
mm,
If you get, hey, I've got $200 free Azure credits, well, you're probably going to just use them, right, and just figure out if it
mm,
works and try and do a trial. So
mm.
that sometimes that comes about that way as well, where someone just uses it and they go from there.
Yes. So, have you observed scenarios wherein people have migrated from AWS to Azure? If yes, what are all the reasons? Why do they migrate? And how this journey has been, Lars?
Yeah.
Mm,
Um, I haven't come across anyone that's sort of gone and what's called lift and shift, like they've taken
yeah.
everything and moved,
Mm,
because
mm,
it's
mm.
so complicated and
Yeah.
so difficult.
Mm,
But there will be, maybe someone got a really good deal from Azure, or from Microsoft, saying, hey, you get 3 years free. I don't know, that's not
mm,
an actual deal, but say
mm,
they got a really good deal from saying,
mm, mm.
you got to move there and you got to do this.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a service they really need. Maybe they have a hybrid setup,
Mm,
so that they started using AWS,
mm-hmm,
say 5 6 years ago, and now they're at a point where there's so much data on their on premises stuff, and there's so
mm-hmm,
much functionality, that they're like, hey, well, if we don't have to shift it, if we don't have to move it to AWS, we can use a hybrid approach. Well,
mm,
why wouldn't we then move some of this, that we have on AWS to Azure? So that's happened.
mm-hmm,
Um, but it's more often than not, it's specific products, or it's specific teams that will move, or
mm-hmm,
there will be a directive from, say, some of the big banks in Australia
mm,
have started going with Azure. I don't know if it's instead of AWS or at the
mm.
same
Okay.
time. I'm not 100% sure.
Mm,
But they have definitely moved some of their products, and wanted help in, hey, we need to upskill all these people, and how do we
mm,
go about learning all this in bulk, basically,
mm, mm,
which is
mm,
kind of what I've been doing with A Cloud Guru.
mm-hmm,
So, yeah, it definitely happens. I don't
mm,
think there's two cloud migration journeys that are the same. They're
mm-hmm,
all very unique, and they're all very specific to what these companies need,
mm-hmm.
because it's such a big deal.
It's true.
But it definitely happens. And as cloud becomes cheaper, more approachable, easier to use, uh,
Mm,
available in more places, well, there's definitely going to be more focus on having either one or two cloud platforms, that you can just use if you're a development team. I definitely think that's part of the future.
absolutely. So we have a number of customers who are in the BizTalk servers, and they are attempting to migrate their integrations to Azure. That is
Hmm.
from on-premise to Azure. So have you encountered such a scenario, or you're familiar, like what are all common challenges that they would encounter, and how can they accelerate this? Any insights here?
Yeah, I mean, first step is always, do I really have to? Right? Like, do I
Question.
really need to move it? Because it's
Yes.
often we get carried away with this sort of like, oh, cloud's going to make it all cheaper, and it's going to be better, and we need to build it again, and it'll be much better. And it's not always that is the
Yeah.
case.
Mm.
So there needs to be a real discussion and conversation around,
Mm.
what's the benefit I'm going to get out of this,
Mm.
practical,
Mm.
move to Azure.
Mm.
And then from there, it's a picking the lowest hanging fruit, which is a bit of a cliche term,
Mm.
but it does
Mm.
make sense that it's, if you have a project that's very defined, so it's on its
Mhm.
own with
Mhm.
very few dependencies, we'll try and move that, because if it breaks, you're not going to break 16 other things around it.
Absolutely. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Or you might go for a hybrid approach to begin with, so that you move something like authentication, you move that
Mm.
to Azure. So if you have an authenticated, um, authentication flow in your application, where you have to log in with,
Mm.
whatever username, password,
Mm.
or your Facebook account, or whatever it is,
Mm.
we'll move that part to Azure,
Mm.
because that's one of
Mm.
those things that's really hard to maintain and manage and develop.
Mhm.
Whereas if you use a finished, product like
Mm.
Azure
Mm.
Active Directory, then you can
Mm.
move that part, and you still get everything is still working the same way, but you have this authentication flow and management of users that is essentially someone else's problem. Like you still
Absolutely.
have to manage some of it, right?
Hmm.
So it's I would always say it's a like find the bits that make sense to move first off,
Hmm.
the bits that have low risk, that have
Hmm.
the least complexity,
Hmm.
and then try and move that
Hmm.
if you're moving things from on premises to Azure, because there are things that you didn't expect. There always is. So having having the least complexity is good when you start out.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So, first step, evaluate and then decide whether your business needs it at this point in time or not. And then
Yep.
identify those components which are eligible to be moved to the cloud, which can be independently moved without impacting rest of your application.
Mm.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
a very good piece of advice. And then comes the choice of service provider, and then how compatible are they, and then proceeding further, isn't it?
Yep. Yep.
It
And
also,
there's
yeah.
while we're talking about it, there's sort of six different ways of looking at
Mm,
how you move things to Azure. Let me just again,
interesting.
I've got my little notes here just so I
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sure I get
sure.
everything right. So they're called the six R's.
Mhm.
Because everything starts with R. It's a very marketing
Okay.
thing. But anyway,
Okay.
make sure you easy to remember. So first of all, you can do what we just talked about, which is rehosting, basically lift and shift. So is there a
Yeah.
possibility for
Mm.
you to take your code, your features, your functions, your products, and move them as one
Into a
thing, right?
container or
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's like if you talk to middle management in any IT company or big company, they'll always love to say lift and shift because it sounds easy and it never is, right? It's still really difficult. It's still very complex,
Mhm.
but it is a way of doing it and say, hey, we're going to try and not break anything and not change anything and just
Absolutely.
have the benefit of the cloud, especially in terms of reliability,
Mm,
scalability,
mm.
storage costs, VM costs, all those things. Try and get
Yeah.
those benefits out of it. Basically the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service kind of benefits of cloud.
Yes.
Um, then the next sort of level up is replatforming.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, everything stays the same, your architecture, your services, but you take advantage of the cloud platform features.
Mm-hmm.
It usually you get better results than just a lift and shift, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, relatively speaking, because you just take advantage of the cloud. You're not just moving things as if they were on premises, right?
Mm.
You can repurchasing. So you might move a product to the cloud and then use a already built-in cloud product.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, it could be instead of having your own email platform, you when you move to Azure, you start using Office 365, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So
Mm.
things like that, where you sort
Mm-hmm.
of you swap things, you basically you outsource it, right? Because you're sort of going, no, no,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to let someone else build this product. I'm just
Solution.
going to use it. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
You can refactor it.
Mm.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's always a good opportunity. Most developers would like to refactor because, as developers, we always go, "Well, I can do that better," right? So we want to go and refactor someone else's code,
Mm.
but it also means you refactor features and architecture. So that's much more involved, but it might be necessary. It might be a good opportunity to take a product that was sort of maybe slapped together and actually do it properly. Who
Mm.
knows?
Mm. Mm.
You could just retire things.
Mm.
Maybe they're not relevant anymore and you have three customers left. You go, well, we're going to have
Mm.
to talk
Mm.
to them and say, we're just going to kill this product. It's too expensive.
Mm.
Or you just retain what you got. So those are the six R's, right? Rehost,
Okay.
replatform, repurchase, refactor, retiring, and
Retiring.
retain.
Retail. Yeah. Good.
Retain.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it is absolutely easy to remember and easy to connect to. Thanks for that, Lars. Yeah. Wonderful. Mm.
that's right. Yeah. So what was your question before that? Sorry, now I got lost.
That's the best part, you know.
Okay.
So my question was, even I got lost. Okay, so we were talking about how should the journey from on-prem to Azure be for the benefit
Yep.
of our
Oh, and
uh,
how do you choose your platform as well?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
mm-hmm.
again, it's like if you have a preferred platform,
Mm-hmm.
almost go with that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I would choose Azure because I know it so well.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, Azure, AWS, and GCP are pretty much the same. There's not
Mm-hmm.
a massive difference in terms of features and etc. But one thing that does change is the tooling. That's probably a good thing to point out. If you already have a development team, if you have software developers or infrastructure people or whoever
Mm-hmm.
employed that are used to a certain tool set, so
Mm-hmm.
for me, that would be Visual Studio, it would be Visual
Absolutely.
Studio Code, it would be
Mm-hmm.
C Sharp, it would be either like a NoSQL database, like maybe MongoDB or Cosmos DB, or even SQL Server.
Mm,
If you have people have that expertise, well, try and retain that, right? So
correct.
if you yeah, and and again, most of the platforms are sort of okay with whatever you want to do. Like Azure doesn't care what programming language you use as long as it's on Azure, right?
Absolutely. Mm,
Yeah. So if you're a Python developer or Ruby or PHP or Java or C Sharp or JavaScript or whatever, they
mhm,
all work on the cloud.
mm,
But it might have something to do with your tooling.
mm.
Yeah, that could be a consideration.
Absolutely, absolutely. Take advantage of the skill set that you possess. And
Mm,
yes. So, yes, and the last few minutes have been a lot of learning in the space of multi cloud. Yes, like what enterprises should consider, when should they consider, and what are all the options available. And thanks a lot for bringing all these key points into the table today for discussion, Lars. And it was a pleasure to have you on our show. Thank you
oh,
so much.
absolutely.
I
Yeah, it
to
went fast.
to end this episode, do you have any key takeaways for people who are in the consideration of migration to the cloud? How welcoming is the cloud world? And
Yeah,
like,
I would almost say that no matter, you know, if you're considering it, do it because there's
mm,
so many benefits in cloud. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP or I do cloud training for a living or whatever. Genuinely it is. There's
yes,
so much benefit in it.
mm,
You abstract so many things you don't want to know about, like hardware
absolutely.
faults and networking equipment and all those things that you would spend so much time on as a business trying to figure out. All that's done for you. Yes, you pay a price for it,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the cool thing. And yes, there are security breaches once in a while, but I bet you have them as well, and you might not even know about them. So yeah, if you're considering cloud computing, well, just stop considering. Just do it. Find a way.
Absolutely, Lars. Yes, whomever is there in the IT field for a decade or so, they will really appreciate the way we build applications today, considering how we used to build long
Oh
time
man.
back.
Oh yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so we are living in the best era of application development and make use of it. That's what we'll have to say. Like, having been abstracted about all the complexities, with the privilege of focusing on the core business values, let us
Mhm.
build modern applications that would make our life much better.
Yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely.
awesome, awesome, Lars. Thanks for being on our show once again.
Cove.co